من المواقف الإنسانية المؤثرة كان عبدالعزيز ما ذكره خادم الحرمين الشريفين الملك رحمه الله في أحد خطبه رواية عن والده بشأن ما كان يقوم به ليلا بنفسه دون علم الآخرين من إحسان الضعفاء والفقراء خاصة في العشرة الأواخر من رمضان في كل عام، ومن بينهم امرأة عجوز نسبة يعرفها، ويقول الملك عبدالعزيز: أعطيتها مبلغ من المال فامسكت بي والدنيا ظلام وقالت: من أنت؟ ولم أقل شيئا لأني لا أريد أن تعرفني. قالت: أنت عبدالعزيز؟ قلت: نعم أنا عبدالعزيز. فاستقبل القبلة وفتحت جيبها وقالت: قل آمين إن الله يفتح لك خزائن الأرض. وبعد أن ظهر الزيت عندنا عرفت أن هذه هي خزائن الأرض.
In 1933, the first foreign oil prospectors started arriving in the kingdom. King Abdulaziz did not care who got the concession, as long as they paid the money up front. The British showed interest, but it was the Americans who paid $170,000 in gold for a concession that would turn out to contain the biggest oil fields on Earth.
The first number of holes was dry, and the question was, why should we continue with this? They had been ordered to stop, and they'd failed to read their mail or whatever, and so they did strike the oil, and that well is today operating.
The Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, was created to prospect for oil and market it. America's 4 largest oil corporations became the sole shareholders.
When King Abdulaziz went to open the first oil field, and he smelled the sulfur, and he was repugnantly surprised by the smell, and they told him, "But Your Majesty, this is what oil, the sulfur of oil smells like." So, let me smell more of it.
The king still had little idea what riches Saudi oil would soon bring. But by 1945, the U.S. urgently needed oil facilities to help supply its forces fighting around the globe. For President Franklin Roosevelt, oil was an American national security priority. From Yalta, FDR sent a message to the Saudi monarch.
The contacts were made, but the decision was kept secret until after he left. The Minister of Finance, Abdullah Suleiman, came to the king's wives and said, "Abdulaziz sends his greetings. I am at sea, on my way to meet Roosevelt. We'll be back in 2 or 3 days."
Any royal trip like this has to be big. And it's not just for a show. No. It's like, unifying all portions of the society with you together. So he had his own advisors. He has some of his own sons, princes. He had some of his tribal chieftains at the time. So it's like a small state moving outside its own state to meet Roosevelt, and it has to be, from all portions of society.
It was a very interesting meeting. Here's Roosevelt in his wheelchair, and as you know, he's not a big man, and he's in a wheelchair. And he's on the deck of the Quincy, and King Abdulaziz, who's about 6'3" and 6'4", big, stricken with trachoma, not seeing too good, but walking with a cane. And these two hit it off right away. King Abdulaziz started kidding Roosevelt about, "You're lucky you're in that wheelchair. You can wheel yourself anywhere." And Roosevelt said to him, "If you like this wheelchair so good, I have an extra one here. I'll give it to you."
After exchanging gifts, they got down to business. America needed to lease an airport and Navy refueling station for its war against Japan. But it was the security of the Saudi kingdom that was at the forefront of King Abdulaziz's concerns. He requested U.S. military assistance and training, and they agreed to construct the Dahran military base. In return, the king guaranteed that the U.S. would always have secure access to Saudi oil.
America struck a pact with Saudi Arabia. You give us oil at cheap prices, and we will give you protection. This protection eventually evolved into an American hegemony over the entire Gulf region, and the deal extended to the Gulf region, that this was an American area of influence, and in return for this, it shall be protected from all enemies.
And then there was the issue of Palestine.
Roosevelt said to him, Your Majesty, you know, I'd like to get your opinion on a problem that I'm facing back home. He said, you know, a lot of my constituents are pressuring me to recognize the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he said, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. And King Abdulaziz said, Mr. President, what Hitler did to the Jews was a terrible thing. It was the worst thing that man could do to man. But he said, I don't understand why you're talking about taking land away from us, the Arabs, and giving it to the Jews. We didn't do anything to the Jews. If you want to do something for the Jews, why don't you give them the best part of Germany?
When he heard the position of King Abdulaziz about this issue, he said, I could promise you one thing. The promise that he could make is that I will not do or make any decision if I don't consult with your side and with the Jewish side. Both sides has to be consulted in order to reach one decision.
But before Ibn Saud even had the chance to enjoy this newfound wealth, World War II broke out, severely curtailing Saudi oil production. Many of the American oil drillers and geologists were called into active service.
American oil production takes the national spotlight. Along with news of our fuel oil shortages comes the fresh warning that our known oil reserves will be exhausted in 10 years.
The war had dramatically diminished reserves in the U.S., and President Roosevelt recognized the importance of Saudi oil to America's future. As a result, Ibn Saud received loans through the U.S. Lend-Lease Act to see him through the war. On February 14, 1945, the king was invited to meet President Roosevelt aboard the USS Quincy. When Ibn Saud mentioned the severe pains in his arthritic legs, President Roosevelt quickly offered him his extra wheelchair. FDR hoped the king might offer him something in return, support for the proposed new state of Israel.
This is something that Ibn Saud, along with all the other Arabs, had opposed strenuously. Roosevelt explained the terrible circumstances of the Holocaust and how badly the Jews had been treated by Germany and needed a homeland of their own. And Ibn Saud looked at Roosevelt straight in the face, apparently, and said, yes, it was a terrible thing. So why wouldn't the Jews be given a bit of Germany for their homeland? Because it wasn't the Palestinians who had ever done any harm to the Jews.
The king received a promise from President Roosevelt that he would continue to be consulted on the homeland issue. But President Roosevelt died 2 months later, and President Truman later supported the UN resolution for the creation of the State of Israel without consulting the king.
While there were some who felt, especially the oil people, that the king, the old king, might retaliate by canceling the oil concession, he made it very clear to us that he was not going to do this. And so the question of Israel became an issue on which we in effect agreed to disagree.
With the end of World War II, drilling resumed in Saudi Arabia.
American firms have opened new fields abroad. Of these, one of the biggest and most important is Saudi Arabia. Beneath its blistering sands lies a near ocean of oil, whose potential reserves are estimated at 150 billion barrels.
Standard Oil of California joined Texaco and Standard Oil of New Jersey and New York to form Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company. With more capital for exploration, oil money came pouring into King Ibn Saud's personal treasury.
This was a personal license to drill oil that Ibn Saud had granted in his lands. It was his money. And to this day, there is a sense in which the House of Saud consider the oil to be their own personal property.
The sudden influx of oil revenues means a new role for King Ibn Saud.
In time, the vast wealth produced would transform Saudi Arabia from one of the poorest nations in the world into one of the richest. It would also have a dramatic impact on the lives of the royal family.